Morning all. G'day. Let me know when you're good to go. Testing 1, 2. David Crucifulli and Jarrod Bleijie. Testing 1, 2, 3. I've just finished speaking to both the members for Toowoomba North and Toowoomba South, who have explained to me just how heightened emotions are in their community at the moment following another tragedy, another young life lost, another alleged stolen vehicle, another time where that community is being torn apart by the youth crime crisis that is happening in Queensland. Today, that community is calling for change, and they are calling for real reform while they grieve the loss of another young life. Another family comprehending the incomprehensible, another community asking, here we go again, and a state again demanding real reform to heal the youth crime crisis. It has to end. We can't continue to see bloodshed in homes, in businesses, on the streets. Queenslanders changing their way of life because of changed laws that have made things easier for a generation of youth crims. And it has to change. And we're going to continue to put forward solutions because this is every part of the state. In the last 24 hours, we saw it in the far west, in Mount Isa, with alleged offenders using vehicles as weapons, as battering rams, running into community facilities, while residents cower for fear. In Cairns, allegations of the revolving door of the broken youth justice system time and time again, not holding people accountable and the community paying the consequences for it. And I want to make a point from my own electorate. And if you will indulge me, I want to read a text message I got this morning from a resident who lives in Runaway Bay called Jeff. And in the last 48 hours at both Paradise Point and Runaway Bay, that community has been under siege. And that is a beautiful, tight-knit community. And these incidents, they're not business as usual. And in the words of Jeff, my kids are so scared. Even my 4-year-old son is asking in a panic, and we told him they're in prison. The first thing he said this morning is, "Dad, are the bad men still in prison?" My 11-year-old daughter slept in my 15-year-old son's bed last night because she couldn't go to sleep. We have full surveillance, full alarms, fully fenced and locked, and even a dog. And I had a gut feeling last night after all the break-ins, so I left the dog in the living room rather than the basement. 10 youths in total, all wearing gloves, baseball bats, a machete. They climbed everything, they were very agile, and they never made a noise. Working like a planned team of professional thieves, operating out of a stolen BMW and a stolen Mercedes. All my neighbours have the same nightly concerns, and we are looking at trying to put funds together for a patrol. I've been in Runaway Bay since 1985, and I've never experienced anything like this. Just feel like we are being attacked. That's in Runaway Bay. And again, I ask the government to acknowledge this is a crisis, and there are solutions on the table. And we have to have consequences for action. We have to unshackle the judiciary and remove detention as a last resort. We have to do better with gold standard early intervention. And we have to try and turn these kids around before it gets to this point. Because we have a generation of untouchables. And the only people who don't acknowledge it is a crisis are the Premier and her ministers, who are the ones who could do something about it. Before I hand over to Jarrod, I just want to make a point regarding housing and to acknowledge that the crisis in housing continues to worsen and has continued to worsen since the government's summit, where they promised to take control of an ever-spiralling situation. Working Queenslanders living out of their cars, living in tents and going to work. Vulnerable Queenslanders at the end of a social housing waiting list that continues to grow. A generation of Queenslanders who are wondering how on earth they got to where they are tonight. We are again calling on the government to adopt our solution, and that is commit that every cent from the Queensland Housing Investment Fund is used to produce new product. The issue we have in Queensland at the moment is because of a lack of supply. And if that money is not being used to build new roofs over people's heads, nothing will change. We absolutely need to partner with councils and deliver infrastructure to open up new opportunities for young kids to buy a home, for people to rent. It's time to get serious about the community housing sector. The only state where that has gone backwards in the last 8 years is Queensland. They're there, they're waiting, they're yearning to be part of the solution. And when it comes to social housing, what we are doing is not working. Yesterday, a minister lauded the fact that foundations were being dug on the first new build 2 years after the announcement of a fund. 2 years after the first announcement, and it'll be another 18 months before the first resident has a roof over their head. Complete and utter failure. We must repair and restore confidence. In the last quarter, Queensland is the only state where the vacancy rate has gone backwards. The number of residential lot approvals has fallen year on year. Building approvals continue to fall. And since the Treasurer's knee-jerk rental tax, we have seen the market spooked. And as a result, the supply issues will continue to come apart at the seams, as has the government's tenancy changes. They didn't listen, they didn't consult, they made the problem worse. And that's cold comfort that we're going to have another round of legislative changes for those Queenslanders living in their cars and in their tents. Over to you, Jarrod.
Well, thank you, David, and good morning, Jarrod Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Well, the chaos and crisis of the Bleijie government is off the rails. Cost overruns and budget blowouts are off the rails. Today, we see a $2.4 billion blowout on another project of Mark Bailey's special. This is Mark Bailey, who has been the minister for many, many years, who should not even be sitting around the cabinet table. He should have been sacked when he was doing secret deals and dodgy emails with the union movement when he was first appointed a minister. He has seen budget blowout on nearly every single project Mark Bailey has overseen. He should not be sitting around the cabinet table. And we see today the $2.4 billion budget blowout on a project that only 2 weeks ago the Premier lauded as $7.1 billion. 2 weeks later, it is $9.5 billion. So in 14 days, we've gone from $7.1 billion to the $2.5 billion budget blowout and no explanation. What's worse for the people of Queensland is they are doing it in a secret way. It was a quiet little website update, one night, no announcement, no fanfare, no openness, no transparency. Simply an update on a website. They are so immune to the issues of cost overruns and budget blowouts now, they don't even tell people. In fact, what they try and do is hide it, trying to deliberately hide billions of dollars of cost overrun and budget blowouts. And as I said, here's the announcement, the media statement from the Premier 2 weeks ago, when she lauded the $7.1 billion project. And just quietly, within one night, it gets upgraded to the budget blowout we see now at $9.5 billion, which is a 33% budget blowout. But Queenslanders would expect nothing more from the Bleijie Labor government and Mark Bailey. This government, this Bleijie Labor government, has a blowout problem. Every project they touch blows out and has cost overruns. And there's no accountability for ministers. There's no accountability for ministers to deliver these projects on time and on budget, because it is just happening daily now. Mark Bailey needs to explain himself today, why they kept it a secret, and how can they lose $2.5 billion in 2 weeks. And they will say, oh, well, the project's expanded, it's bigger than what we anticipated. From 2 weeks ago, I doubt it. And here's the other thing for Mark Bailey to answer. When he's got to justify this budget blowout, another budget blowout under his watch. Why did they keep it secret? Because we've looked at the project and the project hasn't changed. For the $2.5 billion budget blowout, there's not additional trains, The scope of the project hasn't changed and the contract looks exactly the same. Just the figures changed from $7.1 billion to $9.5 billion. So Mark Bailey, he owes Queenslanders an explanation today as to the $2 billion budget blowout and why they secretly put it on a website, quietly updated a website, and didn't announce it to the people of Queensland. I've got to say, this week absolutely has been a horribilis septimana, which is a horrible week for this government. If you have a look this week at the chaos and crisis of the Palaszczuk government, we started the week with Shannon Fentiman. After the Leader of the Opposition had travelled to the Torres Strait Island communities and talked about health care and health services, we raised it in Parliament. The local leaders in that community wrote to the Premier weeks and weeks ago. The opposition leader visited those communities, met with those leaders, and then the government denied there was a problem. All of a sudden, following the opposition leader's lead, Shannon Fentiman, the Health Minister, announced a review. Just announced a review into Torres Strait Island healthcare after denying a review was necessary. We then had Craig Crawford. After the opposition had raised the issues of residential care and kids in crisis care, Craig Crawford all of a sudden announced a review, again, copying the LNP's policy, although quite different. We are sitting down with the stakeholders. We are sitting down with the experts. What Craig Crawford's done is announce an internal review that will be conducted by his Director General that the Premier appointed, and then it will be a report delivered to the Minister. He could do that today. He could sit down with his Director General and say, what are the issues in residential care? What are the experts saying we should be doing differently? And then Stephen Miles came out during the week and blamed the service providers, despite the fact the government provide the money, enter the contracts, it is up to them to do due diligence, and after all, they are the parent of care for the kids in residential care. Mick de Brenny, this week, ruled out any changes to the National Construction Code. A day later, announced some changes and gave false hope to the industry that what they had been calling for was going to be done. And it turns out that he's only slightly amending it. But the reality was he denied there was going to be any changes. 24 hours later, he announced some changes, urgently met with industry. And it has sent shockwaves through the construction industry with this chaos and crisis. Azalea, the young girl at the Gold Coast who needed ear surgery. The opposition leader and Sam O'Connor, the local member, met with the family, talked to Azalea, gave national media coverage for the issue. And what happens? A local community group comes forward to fund the surgery that Azalea so desperately needs for her ear surgery. Not the government, not Shannon Fentiman. A community group comes forward and funds the surgery for Azalea. And tenants. Look at the crisis in the housing at the moment. And the new housing minister, who sat around the cabinet table as Environment Minister and signed off on the tenancy laws that they rushed into Parliament. She signed up to it. So don't accept anything that the new housing minister will try and spin her way out of this, that, oh, we may have, the laws may have been rushed. She made the decision. She sat around the cabinet table with her colleagues Anastasia Palaszczuk and the like and made the decision to rush those laws. They made the decision not to consult. They made the decision not to listen to anyone. They made the decision not to listen to renters, landlords or the experts. And now they're going to have to rush legislation in again to fix their bungle. This is just a week. And to top it off, you now have Mark Bailey at the centre of another controversy, another blowout, $2.5 billion blowout in his portfolio. And he tried to keep it secret. Had we not seen the website update, Queenslanders would be none the wiser to know about this budget blowout. Mark Bailey does not deserve to sit around the cabinet table. He is a disgrace as a minister, and he has overseen budget blowout after budget blowout, time delay after time delay. But because it is the norm of the Palaszczuk government, he gets away with it. And it's wrong. Thanks, David.
Jarrod, happy to.
The website was updated.
Only in the last few days. So it's this is fresh. The Premier was there herself to make the announcement, and there was no mention there about any change to the project scope, cost, or any of the deliverables. Quietly done, just updated on a website, and it took the opposition office to find it. And now today the government's going to scramble to somehow say that things have changed. The only thing that has changed is the cavalier nature of the government to yet another project, and it has to stop. It's wasted opportunity. This money could have built another tertiary hospital in the middle of a health crisis, could have built 4,000 homes in the middle of a housing crisis, could have nearly paid the entire Queensland Police Service budget for a year in the middle of the youth crime crisis. Instead, it goes on cost overruns from a government that just cannot manage things on time and on budget.
The government says it's because their contract, and this is an extension of 18 years. If there is an 18-year extension of this agreement,
An option.
But if there is an extension here, what they are doing is forecasting into the future, and this is money that would be paid over those 18 years between 2032 and 2058, say. Is that not an acceptable use of money? There are forecasting a use of that money to run the trains?
Same number of trains, same timeline, same deliverables. $2.4 billion of money.
They are distinguishing that extra years.
And 2 weeks ago, the government stood at that site and committed this project to be delivered at the original cost 2 weeks ago.
The government is arguing there's now extra years attached to that.
So in 2 weeks, a website is updated in the middle of the night and nothing changes with the number of trains or the deliverables other than the word option and some sort of practice shunting yard. That's no way to run a government in terms of transparency, and it's no way to run a contract, and it's no way to value taxpayers' dollars. We are talking about the same number of trains and a cost blowout that could have built a new tertiary hospital with money left over. And that's just updated as a side note. That is not transparent governance. That is not value for money. That is a government that conducts itself as though taxpayers' money is monopoly money. That's where we've reached in the state of Queensland, and there is a better way.
But if this is forecast over the next 18 years or a further 18 years, would you not expect the scope wouldn't change? Ongoing running costs? A
project was committed to deliver that project for a tick over $7 billion. The Premier stood there a fortnight ago. If this was something the government genuinely thought was a part of the project scope, I would suggest to you the change should have been done in an open and transparent way, and I would have suggested being on the site would have been the time to have announced it. An option to extend a contract doesn't build extra trains, doesn't bring things forward. It is government in the dark.
I understand your point here about the government should have been more transparent about that. But that's a separate point, isn't it, to the actual whether this is a cost overrun. For example, like we have the Gabba, it went from $1 billion to $2.7 billion. Now that's pretty much the same stadium. Here, though, there is an extra 18 years or so, or an extra period of time. The government says there will be, extra trains being run or maintained in that manner. There is an extra time period here. So value for money for the taxpayer. There's an extra period of time.
No, I just do not accept that a project can blow out by 33% in capital cost and the same number of assets are being delivered. I just can't accept that. That's no way to run a government. And if the Minister wants to stand up today and explain why a change would be made on a website and the core deliverables don't change, I would suggest to you he wouldn't last very long in the private sector. That is just not a plausible reason for a 33% cost blowout. It is just not.
Is it misleading to say this money could have gone to cost of living or housing when the forward projections from the budget only go up until the next 4 years? This is predicted decades away.
Well, in the end, it's taxpayers' money, and it has to be found from somewhere. And at some stage, it's only one source that it comes from, and that's Queenslanders. It is only Queenslanders who will have to foot the bill. And if it was one project, you'd cut the government some slack. But it's every project. it's running to the order of 13 billion in cost overruns. That's not the value of the contracts. That's how much the government didn't predict it would cost and overrun. Cross River Rail, Gold Coast Light Rail, the Coomera Connector. It's just, in the case of the Coomera Connector, the project is delayed, there are less lanes, and it's increased by a third. We had 3 train stations go from 120 million to 520 million in the space of a year. You just would not, nobody would last a minute in the private sector if that was the case. You could not find a company in the nation that would make an announcement and 2 weeks later quietly say to its shareholders, well, oh, sorry, it's actually 33% dearer and the asset isn't changing. That's just no way to run a government. This is taxpayers' money, and we have to get back to a time when it means something. And when a commitment is made to deliver something in a time frame and at a cost, it has to be delivered for that. And ministers have to be held accountable. We have to end this. This is no way to treat taxpayers' money at a time when they are struggling to keep a roof over their head, at a time when they pick up the phone, there are 72 less police officers to help them in the middle of a youth crime crisis. The kids can't get a house. AMBOs aren't turning up because of a health system that's not properly resourced. And the government just says, oh, well, that's $2.5 billion. It is just unbelievable. And it is not acceptable for the government to say, well, this is money in Ford budgets. It belongs to the people, and it should be spent the way the people deserve it to be spent.
You mentioned timeframes there, so you don't accept this timeframe is changing?
I don't accept that those trains are coming at the same delivery schedule. They're already behind. They're already behind budget, and it's the same quantum of trains. And I would suggest to you that if your capital cost is increasing by 33% and nothing is changing on the overall delivery of that capital project, I would suggest to you the government is no longer treating taxpayers' money the way it should be.
David, on another matter, there's a woman's complained about her treatment in Bleijie in the hospital there, about her treatment with an ectopic pregnancy. Are you aware of this case? And what do you think?
Yeah, I've only heard of it. I haven't spoken with the woman personally. Just make the point, every Queenslander deserves a world-class health system, no matter what part of the state they live in. And commitments have been made to restore maternity services to areas that women have been able to have births in for generations. And it's almost as though the government's walking away from that commitment. And I was at Weeper the other day, and to listen to the imposition on young families in a community like that, you realise we have to do better. So in the case of places like Chinchilla and Billawheeler, you've got women playing Russian roulette and hoping that they can get to a major hospital without having a baby on the side of the road. In the case of Cooktown and Weeper, they're having to leave their family behind and live in a hotel in Cairns for a month. Imagine saying goodbye to your husband and your kids and have to go and on your own have what should be one of the most special moments as a family. That's the choice that women are making at the moment in these places. And it'd be bad enough if the government hadn't promised to do something about it, but they have. In the case of Weeper, they promised to restore those birthing services in 2020, then again in 2021, then in 2022. 6 months ago, they updated the maternity ward, and now they say, well, it's just all too difficult. And all the while, women are making choices to have to either leave town when it's time to have a family or go and reside in Cairns on your own in a motel. That's no choice in a modern Queensland. And we now have the situation where this government has closed more maternity services than are still open today. And places where women were able to have babies for generations are no longer open. In a modern Queensland, I'm not comfortable with that.
On rental reforms and the subsequent discussion paper put out by the Housing Minister, the acting Premier today said it was entirely appropriate for this law to be rushed through because they always anticipated rental reform will come in stages. Do you think there needs to be, guardrails put in place or some form to prevent a government from pushing through legislation the way that it did with those rental reforms?
Yeah, Majura, I would suggest to you that amending exactly the same piece of legislation isn't the next step of reform. It's a government governing in chaos and crisis. That's what that is. Did you want to make some comments?
Sure. Majura, we warned the government about rushing these rental reforms. The REIQ were noted as warning the government, if you rush these reforms, there'll be unintended consequences. And what did they do? They sat around the cabinet table, they approved it under the Palaszczuk Labor government, they then rushed the laws in a week of Parliament without due committee process, and despite all the warnings, they proceeded with it. And now, of course, we see the unintended consequences. And when these issues were raised, after the legislation had been passed, the former Housing Minister said, no, it doesn't have any impact because these are not starting till the 1st of July. But it had already had an impact. It had an unintended consequence because people were looking at what laws were starting and commencing on the 1st of July. The government knew about it, but they were just so busy to try and get this out of the media and look at how things look rather than the reality of the situation, that both landlords and tenants have been put in a perilous situation. And now they're consulting. They should have done that before. They should have done what they're doing now. They've got a consultation paper out there. They should have done that before. And it just shows that even despite passing these laws months ago, they still hadn't sought proper advice as to how to alleviate this issue or to get around to fix the loopholes in it. Now they're consulting. They're doing what they're doing now, what they did, they should have done months and months ago. And then we wouldn't be in the situation, and tenants, as alleged is happening, wouldn't be being thrown out of their homes on the streets.
Anything else from anyone?
Thanks, Charles. Have a good day.
See you later.